Hello there. What is going on, everyone? Today we are asking the hypothetical question, what if they did an Armada 2.0? What things should it include? What things must it include? What could they do differently, and how really could Armada benefit from a second edition if AMG were to kind of decide that, you know what, instead of just keeping this 1.5 going, well, let's say we kind of reboot it and do a 2.0. And while I know a lot of people might not be crazy about that, it would mean dedicated support. So I'm going to be talking about some things that are at least on my list of things that they could consider doing if a 2.0 could happen. If you guys are new here to the channel, there is still time left to enter to win that lightsaber giveaway. All you have to do is be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. Also, would love for you to check out the links down in the description below. I'd love for you to join our Discord and become part of the community. It's very family friendly, great place to talk more about Armada, X-Wing, Legion, all kinds of stuff like that. So with all that being said, let's talk a little bit about Armada and the possibility of a 2.0, what that could mean. And because I think, initially it's one of those things where, we've seen a lot of changes. X-Wings got basically a whole new edition now. And I think it's got a lot of people wondering, what if they were to make other changes? What if they decided that they wanted to make more changes to other games? So I think while that sounds scary, there's a lot of potential good things. While Armada is a great game and it's in pretty good shape, it could be one of those games that's just totally sustainable forever. But what if they decided they wanted to make some tweaks? I think there's a couple of tweaks that we could really benefit from. And one of the first ones would be with a new edition, we could potentially get more Clone Wars stuff and maybe balance the factions a little bit. If you're kind of starting over again. Now, I would assume they would have conversion kits and things like that. You want still people to be able to use their old stuff. Maybe AMG would do unpainted ships on a sprue, but also with conversion kits for all the old stuff. So if you wanted to do it that way, if you want to just get the new stuff and assemble and paint your ships or whatever, I'm not sure. But that's not really the things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about some real great ways that the game could be improved with a second edition. Because usually when a second edition comes out, you kind of retool everything a little bit. And I think since the Clone Wars came out and was, it's still kind of unfinished, I think this represents some great opportunities to kind of go back to, the drawing board on a whole game. First off, take a look at, your traits, right? Clone, Jedi, Comm, we've got Bombard, Droid, Senate, all these traits. Well, I think if you're doing an Armada 2.0, here's a great opportunity to put traits on every ship. And also make those traits mean something. Those could be a really great way to delineate ships a little bit more. And because let's face it, sometimes in some cases between the Rebels and the Empire, when they have so many ships, a lot of them kind of blend together. And so there's a big difference between these two ships are very, very close, but by the way, this one has comms, so that makes it eligible for a whole bunch of upgrades that the other one just didn't have. So putting traits on every ship would alleviate a major inconsistency between factions right now, and I think that's a great thing that they could potentially do. As well as with the Clone Wars, while it is great for the game, one of my biggest gripes, and this is a personal one, and I'm curious if you guys agree, one of my biggest gripes with the Clone Wars was they kind of went away from this style of card. Of course, this is from Ryan Kingston's Fleet Builder. There was some great work done to kind of bring the new Clone Wars cards back into the traditional style of the older cards. And I think we need to go back to having all the information on the front of the card again. I want the point cost, I want the upgrades, I want the traits, I want everything on the front of the card. You can shrink down the artwork a little bit if you need to. Maybe just flip over and put full artwork on the back. That's fine. But I want all the information on one part of the card. I hate having to flip cards over. Wait, so do I want this on that? No, is that going to work on this? Or well, this guy doesn't have the dice for this upgrade. I hate having to flip cards over just to, when building lists. I think it's a terrible, terrible might be an extreme. I think it was maybe one of those things that just didn't quite hit the target for me. So I would love to kind of go back, because right now you've got 3 different sizes of cards, right? You've got the new small, well, maybe 4 different sizes if you think of all the 1.0 really small ones that work. But I mean, between the tarot cards, the regular baseball card sizes, and then of course the Superstar Destroyer was on like a jumbo size. You got all the, and then of course the little micro ones. So we can probably get everything back on the same sheet of music. Maybe everything could go on one like a regular baseball card size sheet. Maybe you just retool things a little bit, shrink some borders down a little bit to make it all fit. But either way, I'd love to have everything, all the information on the front of the card. Another aspect that could be looked at is Onagers, and in a lot of different ways, and not just Onagers specifically, but a lot of different things about them that came out in this wave. Like, first off, ignition attacks in general. I think ignition attacks could use some attention because they do kind of have the potential to create a negative gameplay experience, especially if there are some builds that really exploit the Onagers' longest range attack, especially if you do a speed 1 move and a certain title that lets you attack right away before your opponent can do anything. And there are really ways to abuse that. And it's also like one of those kind of lists that like always does really good, and I feel like it's too good. It's like I don't like to run Onagers very much because they're a little bit too good. Granted, I have lost with Onagers, but they were deliberately bad, like kind of jank build Onagers. So I'd love to see ignition attacks changed a little bit to be, still kind of still do what they want to do, but be less disastrous for the game as a whole. One thing, an easy way to do this, because Onagers aren't the only people that do ignition attacks. Venators can also do it. But I would love for one, ignition attacks to be salvoable. Right now, this is something that you could easily just do with an RRG entry or whatever. But if you're rebooting everything with a 2.0, let's take another look at ignition attacks. I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't be able to do a salvo on an ignition attack, provided you are within range of a salvo attack. So if you're at extreme range, maybe you can't, right? You're too far away. But what if you could? But if you're at maybe long range, medium, or even close range, maybe that salvo attack is now kind of a detriment because it's going to get you killed, right? Because they're going to salvo you back. So ignition attacks, I think they should be salvoable if you're already within range. But then what if we reduced the range on salvo attacks just a little bit? Like you didn't have that completely, like that double extreme long range. I've floated the idea around of you still have the short, medium, and long range for ignitions, but instead of using close, medium, and long, you flipped that movement tool over and did distance 1, 2, and 3. So you would still potentially have 3 different ranges, but even at distance 3, that's not going to be nearly as, completely table crossing as long range. And that's why you still have something that you still can do extreme range and can still go farther than long range and farther than a lot of other ships, but it's not, getting those turn 1 shots, right? An alternative way would just be like that. Maybe you take away that title that lets you do the ignition on the first turn of the game. I mean, that's maybe another way to do it if you're doing a whole 2.0. There's a lot of different, suggestions on how to maybe make ignition attacks a little bit less game ruining for some people, or less overpowered. I think that's probably a better way to put it. Is they do kind of sometimes feel overpowered. But there's other things here that I think could be looked at that came with the Onager, and not all of it's necessarily bad. I really like the Rake Hell title that lets you do if you're at speed 0, lets you do if you have a nav dial and or you want to do a speed 0 turn, it lets you do that. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So it's kind of like you're just doing like one of these. You're just kind of swinging around a little bit. And I was thinking to myself, like, why? I mean, that sounds like a pretty standard maneuver. Why is it only this one title can do that? Wouldn't it be interesting if all ships had the ability to do that? If you're at speed 0, but you still have a nav command, you still have power to engines, and you're holding still, shouldn't you be able to swing? Like we do see stuff like that in, there's maneuvering thrusters on ships. And so I think you should be able to do minor moves to the left and the right. As a matter of fact, I'd go so far as to suggest that that maybe you go all the way and say that there's also some kind of strafing. And so instead of just doing the straight turn, maybe you do the turn and then go back. Or maybe you have like a new maneuver tool that does let ships do much smaller it's still considered at speed 0, but much smaller maneuvering, because there's sometimes where you get stuck and you can't like reposition. And then like there were two ships kind of get stuck and like bumping each other for a whole game. And realistically, they would try to maneuver around, and I think that could be something that'd be nice to be able to do. Especially if you're kind of redoing the game from the ground up or doing a 2.0, maybe why shouldn't every ship be able to do a zero speed turn? I mean, you're taking a huge risk by being at speed 0 to begin with. So I think that's something that should be looked into. I'm not saying there wouldn't be risks associated with that, because some people will still stall and try to wait for the right position, but you're still taking a tremendous risk being at speed 0, especially in a world where ignition attacks might still exist. That could be a very bad thing. Another thing that I think hopefully everybody will agree with is retooling the bases. Now, these bases are great. They're one of the things I love about the game, how you can keep track of so many different things on a base without having to have multiple different tools and things. You got all your arcs, you get the lines, you got the dice reminders, you get the shields. You've got so many fantastic aspects of the way that these components are designed. Except for one small problem, and that's that little like notch in the center bottom of every single ship, in that it kind of extends down. What if you just made these bases just I want to say maybe a 2 millimeters taller? What happens is anytime you land a little bit farther than this on an obstacle, to where that middle little plastic piece directly underneath here touches a piece of the cardboard, it raises the whole thing up, and now your ship spins. And you guys have been playing Armada and have landed on an obstacle kind of right in the middle, know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, look, they knew that there was going to be cardboard. They knew the size and the depth of the cardboard, right? And so like this was like one of those things where like the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, because it doesn't happen in every game. But when it does happen, it's completely infuriating that your ship, in a game that should be at least a little bit precise, is wobbling all over the place, and like sometimes they just spin. So I absolutely hate that, and it could be easily rectified by just raising the legs a little bit or pushing that middle piece up a little bit. So but it would require a whole new type of base. Again, if you're doing conversion kit stuff or whatever, maybe it's just you do an updated base. And as long as the length and width are, that the height doesn't really matter in Armada. So if they just raised it up a little bit, it could still be compatible with the old bases. But I would love new bases on top of just them being more functional in the game. I'd love for them to be able to have some molds and sell multicolored bases as optional purchases or flavor buys. X-Wing had done that years ago, and I think it'd be really cool. I know a lot of people would love to get like all purple bases or green bases or orange bases, red bases, so on and so forth. It'd be cool stuff to also be able to do that at the same time. But this is a big one for me. Just retool the bases a little bit. If you're doing a whole new edition, it's never been a better time to just fix, like, with one of those, the silliest little problems with Armada that everybody hates when it happens. It's when you land on that asteroid and start spinning around, Let's talk about Squadrons. I think there's a lot that we could potentially change with Squadrons. I have not always been the biggest fan of Squadrons in Star Wars Armada, but at the same time, I recognize that a lot of people really do, because there's a big part of me that would have loved to have just rolled dice. You look at an ISD is like this big. So really, like, if it was in scale, you wouldn't even see a TIE fighter or an X-Wing, right? Or they'd be like the size of grains of sand on your tabletop. So, or thereabouts. But, here they're comically large, because it's a sliding scale. I get that. That's fine. But there's certain aspects to Squadrons that I've never really liked in this game. They do clutter up the board a lot, so that's something we could take a look at. But the fact that you have to deploy with all of them, it changes a lot, because deployment advantage is certainly an issue, or it's a thing, maybe not an issue, but what if Squadrons all started like on board your ship? Like there's a card called Rapid Launch Bay that when it showed up, I was like, oh, this is great, because it's almost like a fix to the game. The way, like, one of the things I've always hated about Squadrons, they all have to be off the ship at the start of a battle. I'm like, well, a lot of times, ships don't launch fighters all the time. They kind of keep them on board the ship until they're close enough to engage. Why would you launch TIE fighters way too far away to engage enemy ships or squadrons? So you'd probably wait until you were, at a reasonable range before launching them. So what if just rapid launch bays, instead of being an upgrade card, was just a rule? Like, what if every ship automatically had rapid launch bays. I think that'd be a cool idea. I think it'd be a really cool idea. Because I think it would make the game a little bit more thematic, and you would still have the option of launching Squadrons turn 1 if you wanted to, because maybe something really fast Squadrons do want to launch from safety because they have the speed to be able to zip in, or maybe there's some new objectives that Squadrons need to go after and things like that. So that could be, there's still reason to do that, but it would also kind of bring in the deployment and the activation count and stuff like that a little bit. Another thing is, what if they had to engage, what if they had to touch in order to engage? Squadron play has so much precise measurements from each squadron. I got to be within range 1 of this guy, but outside of engagement range of this guy, but I got to be in snipe range of this guy, and so on and so forth. What if you made it simpler and just said they had to touch to engage? So you're not always kind of measuring that distance 1 of this one, this one, this one, and this one. I wonder if that would potentially change and really speed up games a lot. That's an idea that had been kind of tooled around with a little bit. So that could be something that speeds things up a little bit. Or what if the bases were a little bit smaller? Because again, Squadrons sometimes clutter up the battlefield, especially when somebody brings like a large 134 points of Squadrons kind of list. They can really get in the way, and I think they take away a little bit from the capital ship combat. I think of when I want to see like TIE fighters and X-Wings on the board, that's when I want to play X-Wing. But when I want to play Armada, I want to see Star Destroyers and MC-80s and Corellian Corvettes and Nebulons and things like that. I want to see, those capital ships doing battle for Armada more so. And I want to see, because some builds are more Squadron than they are ship as far as plastic. So, maybe those bases are a little too big, because the bases are kind of large. And what if, let's just say, talking about cluttering up the battlefield a little bit, what if they were tokens instead of miniatures? And I'll take this one step further, because that's, I think, a thing that some people aren't going to like. And I'll say, what if they were tokens and miniatures? Now, hear me out. Let's just say, you had to keep the cost of a starter or squadron packs and things like that. Then you just had the token. You set the token down. The exact same dimensions as the token would be something kind of like this that you could put on top of the token. So if you wanted to play with the Squadrons, you could optionally get the Squadron plastic pack. Or if you just wanted to play with tokens, you could play with just the token pack. I mean, it's an idea. I think they'd probably go one way or another, because you might not like it if you wanted to play with all the tokens, or you wanted to play with all the miniatures, but your opponent shows up with only tokens. It might kind of take away. So you kind of want the game standardized, but it would also kind of make for less clutter, and it'd be much easier to measure line of sight if underneath each squadron you had a token, that would, like, so you could pick up the miniature, then measure, and then put all the miniatures back down. Especially when you're doing the movement tool over a bunch of squadrons, you're not sure which ones you're going to bump or not. Being able to, and sometimes you can pick them up and put like a quarter down or another token down there, but that's less precise. So what if on the bottom of them, instead of being kind of hollow underneath, there was that little token that kind of fit in there? And so this way you can kind of pick them up. It would be more precise. Like, that'd be kind of a, again, these are just ideas on ways to kind of reduce clutter, because I think a second edition should kind of look at, how sometimes squadron play slows down the game and clutters up the field, and it makes it very difficult to measure line of sight. And tokens and squadrons get bumped around quite a bit, and they're not very precise with how often we have to pick them up and put them back down. So, maybe tokens is worth thinking about. And maybe it is. Let's talk about Salvo. Salvo was a pretty cool mechanic that really did a lot to improve the game, I think. I really like Salvo as a token. It's unfortunate that it came out so late in the game, right? So if you're doing a 2.0, maybe Salvos becomes a little bit more standardized. Maybe way more ships now have Salvo as a defense token. We've gotten so many new things. We've gotten lots of new defense, a couple of new defense tokens at least over time. And a lot of new different things added to the game over time. But Salvo's a cool one, and maybe we just kind of re-look at how we want to kind of assign defense tokens to ships. Salvo should be, I think it should be pretty standardized, and probably should appear on most ships. And it does mean you wouldn't still have upgrades that add Salvo, because maybe some ships would benefit from eventually gaining a second Salvo. But yeah, I think that would be a kind of a cool thing if Salvo was on a lot more ships. instead of like for the Rebels and the Empire just being on one ship, you know. So I think that's something that you could definitely address if you had a second edition. Another thing that I think you could look at in a second edition, one thing we noticed, especially in the Clone Wars, there was so much more variety between ships. Every ship has two different versions, and I think that's a great way to approach things. But what if there was, this was something you looked at in a 2.0, and you said, hey, in the Clone Wars, look at the hard cell. Right? Look at how much difference there is between the two versions of the hard cell. It's like a whole different ship, so it's really cool. And then you look at certain ships that are like, oh, it's kind of the same in both. Like there's some that's like, oh, or interdictors or MC80s, like there's not as much difference between the two. Well, MC80 One style at least has one that has a double defensive retrofit. That's kind of cool. But still, like Liberty MC80s are largely similar. It's like a single die difference. Oh, this one has an extra red minus a blue. Well, this one has one extra black in the anti-squadron. And so like having an extra die is cool, but like their anti-ship profiles are so similar, right? Like they're not really that different. And so yeah, a lot of times you just end up taking what's cheaper, or but not always. My point is they don't feel like they're two different types of ship of the same class. It's so they're very, very minor differences, and I would love to look at these and say, well, maybe we can change the upgrades around between them a little bit more, a little bit more meaningfully, or maybe even some of the different types of ships have extra defense tokens. Like maybe this guy, maybe one of them, the cheaper one, doesn't have a salvo. Maybe that's something that more expensive ships get. Right, and that's another way to get more salvos out there, is the more expensive version of every ship like also has a salvo, but the cheaper versions don't, right? Like that, or something like that. There's a lot of little ways that you can look at making the two different versions of different ships more meaningful. And it doesn't even have to be only two. You could certainly look at kind of giving it the ISD approach, where you have 4 versions of some ships. That could be an option, especially if you're starting over with 2.0. You're not going to probably have 11 ships per faction right at the beginning. So, waves 1 and 2, you may only have a handful of ships per, like maybe 2 or 3 ships per faction. But if you got like 3 versions of each of them, that could be an interesting thing. I think you want to keep it even numbers though, so you can still flip the cardboard upside down. So I mean, I'm still okay with just 2 versions of most ships. I'm absolutely okay with that. But because I don't want to have a whole bunch of extra cardboard ship profile things laying around. I like just being able to have my base together and then just flip it upside down depending on which one I'm using. So like that much is really good. Again, Armada's a great game and it's almost perfect, but there are some little things, and I think the variety between ships could absolutely be improved. Give you a great opportunity to also kind of fix that other interdictor, give us some reason to not maybe do that a little bit better. Another thought of mine is when you have certain cards. Now, there's not that many in Armada that do this, but there are a few cards that reference a token or something new, that reference something new that wasn't in the game already. It'd be nice if it also showed you what the new thing did. So, for example, with Sabine dropping a proximity mine. Well, maybe I don't have that little rules document that tells me exactly what a proximity mine does. Like, oh, is that something that when they end their movement, or is that the start of their movement, or is that something I detonate at the end of the activation phase, or is it the start of the ship round when it goes off? And all these things like that. And not everybody has these committed to memory. And while there's little rules, sheets and helper guides and RRGs that you can print out and have tableside, it would make a lot more sense if the proximity mine was actually printed on her card, right? And anything that drops that, and that's just, I think, a good rule of thumb to do for future things as well, when you can. If nothing else, if you're looking for something to put on the back of the card, that'd be a great idea to put at least on the back, like helper text on the back of all of these cards. I think would be a cool idea. So it wouldn't be something that you would need, but it could be like useful if you're like, oh, what does this do again? And then it's right there. But still, I mean, if there's room on the front of the card, why not? I think it's a great idea. And again, if we're changing everything to the full size cards, I think you'll have plenty of room. And I think the last thing would be like scum, mercenaries, pirates, or stolen ships, right? Well, like we've talked, you know, a little bit about like legions getting mercs, and you know, it happened with X-Wing a long time ago that they got a whole nother faction. I don't know if you'd get a whole faction of scum and villainy, but if you're doing a 2.0, I would love to see an option for like for at least for one-offs. You know, maybe the wild card wants to join your fleet. Maybe Hondo Anaka's you know, spaceships are going to join the separatists today. It would allow for things like the Katana fleet too, for things to be multi-faction, or you know, as in the way of a merc. Or it would potentially allow for scum or battle force type things that Legion's getting. But also I'd love to see the idea to do stolen ships. You know, sometimes, you know, a ship that we see the most of, it ends up going to a faction that we never really see it with. You know, I talk a little bit about like the Lambda shuttle. You know, I would love to have a stolen shuttle Tidarium for the rebels. You know, and maybe there's a certain card that represents that this ship has been stolen. Nebulons used to be Imperial. Shouldn't we be able to have a Nebulon for the Empire? You know, the rebels used the Phoenix home, you know, the Quasar. We really only ever see a Quasar used by the rebels, I mean, for the most part, but yet in this game, it's only really usable for the Empire. So it would be nice if there was a way kind of from the ground up to allow for stolen ships. And you could even say that it's only certain ships can be stolen, or maybe there is a blanket way for any ship to be stolen. Maybe it becomes much weaker. Maybe it can't take upgrades, or maybe you have to apply a stolen card to it that, you know, cuts certain values in half because, you know, it's not native to, you know, to this faction. So I don't know, but I think that'd be a kind of a cool thing to think about as you're designing like a 2.0 rule set. Maybe plan for the possibility of stolen ships and things to go cross faction, because it would allow for some really cool fleet builds, especially like thinking about like, hey, what if the New Republic, you know, flew one of these Star Destroyers before they broke it down and turned it into a Starhawk? You know, it would allow for a lot of what-if battles. Of course, I guess there's nothing stopping you from doing that now, but I don't want to have to homebrew cool things like that. I want that to be part of the rules, because I want to be able to go to a tournament and see other people try it out too. You know, that'd be a fun thing. All right, guys, that's all I've got for today. Again, just thinking out loud about what would they do if it was an Armada 2.0. But I want to hear from you guys. What are some of your thoughts? What are some things that you'd like to see in a potential second edition of Armada, if that were to ever happen someday? And again, I'm not saying it does need to happen, but I think it'd be pretty cool. All right, you guys, that's going to do it for today. Big thanks to my patrons. You guys are absolutely amazing. I will talk to you guys soon. Always remember, the Force will be with you as long as you wear your socks on your feet.